He is the author of many luminous books, including In the Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition, Hewson's Tavern, B. Jenkins, The Field Trio, The Little Edges, and The Service Porch. Fred's poetry has been nominated for and won many prestigious awards. To name only two, The Field Trio, published in 2014, which I have had the privilege of reading with my students this year, was a poetry finalist for the National Book Award and winner of the California Book Award for Poetry. Fred is also the co-author with Stefano Harney of The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study, a book that, when it was published in 2013, launched 1,000 reading groups, one of which happily has taken root on our own campus. In 2016, Fred was the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, as well as the Stephen E. Henderson Award for Outstanding Achievement in Poetry by the African American Literature and Culture Society. Those who've had the exquisite pleasure of reading Fred's work will, I think, support me when I say that it is not really possible to distinguish in any meaningful way between his more explicitly theoretical work and his poetry. I shall therefore attempt to say just a few words about these two different sides or aspects of his work in all of their fugue-like complicity without attempting a distinction. Fred's writing has traveled across many themes and objects, including literature, music, jazz, poetry, Black aesthetics, the Black radical tradition. He has written about Black spectatorship and Black optics, and in a virtuoso counterpoint to these, about the materiality of screams, moans, and other phonic substances, alerting us to the subtle challenges that this materiality has posed to dominant theories of aesthetics. He's written about Marxism, and specifically Black Marxism, that special corner of the Black radical tradition, which is also to say that vast Atlantis-like continent of the mind, whose legacies can seem strangely lost to us today. Or rather, they seem strangely lost until we recover them in Fred's work. In his work, he has written about work, about academic labor, adjunct labor, the feminization of academic labor, about the neoliberalization of the university, the student debt crisis, the subprime mortgage crisis, the relationship between the university and carceral institutions, the correctional nature of all institutions, and all of these, again, in relation to Blackness, to literature, to music, to jazz, and to poetry. Fred's work moves through dense webs of intertextuality. The debt, and I quote, is excessive, but also joyful. This is writing that lets you eavesdrop on a conversation between Bob Marley and Frantz Fanon. Writing that makes you feel like you are at a dance party with Solwyn and Steve Biko. Writing that puts Curtis Mayfield on the same planet as Gayatri Spivak and Jacques Derrida. Writing that makes you hear Thelonious Monk on every page. It is in part through these sonic and auditory hallucinations that Fred's writing is plugged into place. It can feel like he has been following you. He's there with you on Valencia in San Francisco, in Irvine on Jamboree. It is in part through this attention to place that Fred's work untangles and reknots the ties that bind the present to the past in ways that can make you flinch. This is writing that articulates at least two Birminghams, at least two Angolas. This is writing that convinces us so deeply of the capacities for creativity and the generativity of culture under conditions of radical dispossession that it dares us not just to imagine, but to plan liberation. Writing that is so deeply convinced of the need for and capacities for solidarity, community, and communication with and between Black, brown, and indigenous peoples, refugees, women, lesbian, gay, queer, and trans people, the differently abled, adjunct labor, minimum wage labor, the incarcerated, the homeless, students carrying debt. It is so deeply attuned to this communication that it teaches us to listen so that we can begin to hear the planning that is already going on in a backbeat, in a bass line, in the break, in the little edges, in that moment when the jam is paused. I have two housekeeping announcements. One is there will be a reading that Fred will be giving later on this same evening at UMass Amherst at Memorial Hall. It's at 8 p.m. and we are all invited, and I sincerely hope that you will all go. I hereby invite you. And there will be a reception after that reading as well, since there hasn't been time to organize a more formal meeting with students and others here. We hope that many of you will attend the reception at UMass after that reading. And then the second housekeeping item is simply to please remember to silence your phones. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Fred Moten.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was impossible to live up to, but I will do the best I can. But I really appreciate it. Thank you, Christoph. Thank the students and faculty here, and also especially thank Professor Schocket's family here. It's been a pleasure and a great set of lessons, getting more familiar with his work over the past few months. And I hope I can do a little justice, even if it's obliquely, to the care and the intensity with which he paid attention to literature and to working class life, which I want to try to do a little bit of today. I'm just going to start. I have this bad habit of first of all apologizing for what I'm about to do, and then also like telling you all this stuff I'm going to do, and then I wrote it already out in the paper already anyway, so I'm just going to, it's like a horrible bad habit, and I'm trying to get over it. So the title of the talk is Manic Depression, or the original title is Manic Depression, of Poetics of Hesitant Sociology, and it's slightly modified. It's Manic Depression / Mantic Disposition, which is, the mantic is a term that is usually meant to refer to a kind of divinatory enthusiasm that often inhabits the work of certain visionary people who sometimes get called poets or prophets or whatever. And it's the root, of the word romantic. And I think over the course of trying to work through some of this material, I've had to come to grips with my own romanticism and try to not be so embarrassed about it. So that's what I'm going to try to do today. So, Manic Depression, Mantic Disposition. I want to begin in following the lead, as I have done over the past 10 years often, of Jared Sexton, who begins his extraordinary essay, The Curtain of the Sky, with an epigram from this poem by Rita Dove called David Walker, 1785 to 1830. I'm going to read the whole poem. Free to travel, he still couldn't be shown how lucky he was. Actually, I'll have to stop. I'm horribly and presumptuously assuming that everybody in here knows who David Walker is, and I shouldn't assume such. David Walker, whose years have been given here, 1785 to 1830, was an extraordinarily important figure in the abolitionist movement in the United States. He was active as a trader and a sort of boat operator in the seaport town of Wilmington, North Carolina, and then eventually moved to Boston. He's most famous for his appeal to the colored citizens of the world, particularly the citizens of the United States, which was published in 1829, and which was such an incendiary and emphatic abolitionist tract that it not only helped to, create that abolitionist ferment that, or to intensify that ferment that had already been in place, but that was felt in certain quite specific and violent ways, for instance, in the Great Dismal Swamp a few years later with Nat Turner's rebellion, but in all kinds of incidents of slave revolt that occurred constantly throughout the South during this period. But Walker was particularly interesting in part because not only he wrote this extraordinary text, but he also figured out these really profound and interesting ways of circulating that text. He had a used clothing store in Boston that catered to sailors, and often he would just sew the pamphlet into their clothes, right? Sometimes with their knowledge, sometimes not. But he, again, figured these profound ways of circulating the extraordinarily rich and theoretically sophisticated sentiments that he produced around slavery and around the quest for black freedom. One of the important things to know about Walker is that, like many prophetic figures in the black radical tradition, often his criticism was most intensely directed towards other black folks, and this sort of kind of constitutes the problematic that I want to begin to try to talk about today. Okay, that's the last time I'll interrupt myself. David Walker, 1785 to 1830. Free to travel, he still couldn't be shown how lucky he was. They strip and drag and beat us about like rattlesnakes. Home on Brattle Street, he took in the sign on the door of the slop shop. All day at the counter, white caps, ale-stained peacoats, compass needles eloquent as tuning forks, shivered, pointing north. Evenings, the ceiling fan sputtered like a second pulse. Oh heaven, I am full. I can hardly move my pen. On the faith of an eye wink, pamphlets were stuffed into trouser pockets, pamphlets transported in the coat linings of itinerant seamen, jackets ringwormed with salt traded drunkenly to pursers in the Carolinas, pamphlets ripped out, read aloud. Men of color who are also of sense. Outrage, incredulity, uproar in state legislatures. We are the most wretched, degraded, and abject set of beings that ever lived since the world began. The jeweled canaries in the lecture hall tittered, pressed his dark hand between their gloves. Every half step was no step at all. Every morning, the man on the corner strung a fresh bunch of boots from his shoulders. I'm happy, he said. I never want to live any better or happier than when I can get a plenty of boots and shoes to clean. A second edition, a third. The abolitionist press is perfectly appalled. Humanity, kindness, and the fear of the Lord does not consist in protecting devils. A month, his person, is that all, found face down in the doorway at Brattle Street, his frame slighter than friends remembered. Walker was killed in 1830, most probably as a result of bounties that were put on his head by slave owners in the South. And I'll just point out again that the epigraph that Jared Sexton uses for his essay, The Curtain of the Sky, is just two lines from the third stanza of the poem, which is most probably meant by Dove to be a slight reworking of actual words that are a part of Walker's text. And so she writes, "We are the most wretched, degraded, and abject set of beings that ever lived since the world began." If we tarry with Dove's poem and its echo of Walker, dealing with its own problematic, we must become concerned with what it is to know one's own wretchedness. How does one come to regard oneself or one's group as the most wretched, degraded, and abject set of beings that ever lived since the world began? What does it mean that such a formulation is uttered from the point of view of its object? If I am so degraded, how can my word be taken for it? How would I ever have come to know and to think and to speak this degradation? It's not just that to speak such a formulation is already to have undermined it, since knowledge of one's degradation, supposedly achieved in the examination of one's degraded life, is a characteristic of one who has, at least in part, been lifted out of that degradation. But perhaps being degraded, abject, wretched is something other than what we might have thought, such that seeing and speaking that degradation is not predicated on having left it and then having occupied some conceptual scheme that is outside and above it and from which it can be seen. At the same time, perhaps this is a formulation about us in the righteousness of being against them that can only have emerged from or in the condition of never having learned to be with us. What is it to speak for us in speaking against us while appealing to us? Speaking against here is not simply saying, however truthfully, a brutal thing. Implicit here is that sense of against that one accesses by way of the German word for object, Gegenstand, which is or indexes a condition of standing against in a kind of detached opposition to the one for whom that standing against shows up in and as a kind of stillness. In this regard, Walker might be said to stand with us in his regard of us and in his regard for us as we stand against a kind of subjectivity that he unsuccessfully embodies insofar as he is us or even ours, and therefore cannot fully be his own. How can we see ourselves? We ruminate constantly on and within our regurgitation of utterance that both emerges from but also instantiates the putatively normative point of view. This is the terror of a certain upward and outward mobility. The problem isn't just the shame that attends double consciousness. The problem is that shame seems absolutely crucial to and constitutive of liberatory political desire. The doubleness of the how you look is what is given here. How do you look to them or to me when my own looking is, in its own double sense, a regurgitation and rumination of theirs? And how do you look, where look might imply looking at, where at could also be to or through or away from them, even as looking at us, not them, bears the trace of something like looking as them. But look could also imply looking with, which is to say, looking with and also therefore as that which is not them. Black study has always been an intense rumination on and in some form of this complex of questions. This complex might seem to be the same as that regarding the ability or inability to attend to Black suffering, though we might consider that our suffering is not equivalent to our wretchedness, though it might be bound up with what Miguel Molino, by way of Frantz Fanon, gets at under the rubric of damnation. We might consider also that insofar as there is an unbridgeable gap between the reality of our suffering and the idea of our degradation, it is unsutured by anything like what might be called suffering's redemptive or purgatorial value. There is no redemption, and moreover, there can be no redress. Finally, consider that if our suffering is tied to degradation, it is so in the case of the author of that suffering. This is not some simple moral calculus following from the notion that brutality degrades the brutal. Degradation's most elemental relation is not to brutality or the brutalized, but to a specific mode of exaltation or transcendence. Degradation is given, as it were, in subjection, in the passionate attachment to power, to use Judith Butler's terms. Secondarily, one might say something like this, that degradation is given in a certain Black capacity to desire, as Frank Wilderson articulates and enacts it, as Sexton indexes it, as Dove dramatizes it in the poem by way of Walker's graphic utterance of it. What then is the relation between those who think or exhibit this passionate attachment or Black capacity to desire, and the men of color who are not also of sense. Those whose supposed happiness, who supposedly having been inured to suffering, whose supposed acceptance of or envelopment by the role of the hostile, uncaring spectator, while simultaneously being brutally objectified and fixed in the role of the happily victimized and abject servant, so that this monstrous figure, most immediate to the sovereignty that dominates it, truly is the observed of all observers, is remarked and decried by the one who suffers and desires invisibly, in noble mimicry of ignoble mimicry, otherwise known as normative subjectivity's sad modalities of impersonation. Somehow, says a certain invisible man, our degradation is most clearly given in the figure who cannot see or know or grasp it, the one whose Black capacity to desire is non-existent or otherwise or directed elsewhere. If this is the case, the we, i.e. that we that animates or is the subject of the sentence, we are the most abject people who ever lived, the we sutures over a difference that might either animate or deanimate the ontological totality, depending upon how we attend to it. We could call that difference a conflict, even an antagonism, but for now, let's call it a struggle. Then we can try to think about how such struggles should be characterized and described. The topography of the internal dehiscence, the fractures that it bears, as well as the fracture that it is of this we, of the we who are the most abject set of beings that ever lived since the world began, is brought into sharper relief and sharper theoretical focus, as it is a matter of both mathematics and social geography all the time, in another line from the poem, i.e. in another echo of David Walker, men of color who are also of sense. This lets us know that the field of abjection is divided, that there are differences, levels and degrees of light in the general benightedness, and that the difference internal to abjection is what allows some portion of the abject to recognize itself. But such a difference is always subject to misrecognition. Such misrecognition is always subject to disavowal, even if that disavowal takes the form or does the work of a mirror, within which an interior intersubjective conversation might ensue. My capacity to see and to desire, which bespeaks something other than abjection, allows me to see my abjection in you. That abjection is in fact there for everyone else who has sense, where in this more general regard, having sense is a sign of non-objection to see. And insofar as this is true, I am you, we are one in our abjection, which I can see in you who are my mirror. My color trumps my capacity to see, to sense, to have sense, to discern meaning, which is why that capacity, which can only ever remark but never rise above my degradation, can only be marveled at as a cruel and curious thing. Is my abjection visible in and as your nonsensical behavior or in our skin? Does my skin of necessity make my every observation stupid, as Kant says? No, not if I can, in fact, discern just this irreducible defect. In which case, the theory of epidermalization sutures over a difference that black skin cannot fully bear. The abjection that we share in common, which shows up in the realm of the global as an apprehensive quality that otherwise we would think accrues to ontological reach, is cut by the difference between sense and nonsense. Who determines what constitutes good and proper sense? What are the norms of sense? How do we negotiate the relation between the necessity of freeing ourselves from the very norms of sense that allow us to recognize that necessity and our constant and legitimate demand to freely exercise the good sense that we have and are constrained serially to announce as ours? How do we negotiate the relation between the good sense that requires us to refuse good sense and the X sense that accented extra sense, often taken for nonsense, that Lewis Gordon calls the dark side of theory, that we are constrained and privileged to embrace as blackness. This is the key question which Afro-pessimism heroically addresses so as to stave off the disavowal of X-sense, the embrace of enclosed common sense, a project of disavowal that I will call the post-black, and which has in its discursive contours and in some of its assumptions an undeniable family resemblance to Afro-pessimism. To point out this resemblance is not to suggest an identity. Indeed, I think of these tendencies as the fraternal twins of black radicalism, though I believe their relations are strained, if not fully estranged, so that I should be clear about the intensity of my alignment and alliance with the pessimistic over the post. Perhaps this is bound up with the problems that attend the derivation of sense from the sensorial intelligence and theoretical sensations that surround it. There's something interesting to be derived from the differences between what art historians Huey Copeland and Darby English themselves seek to derive from our ongoing sojourn in what English calls black representational space. A difference between lingering in and leaving a zone which is at once carceral and fugitive, which Copeland theorizes as the undercommon chance of blackness in and as theory, but which English theorizes as an ultimately and necessarily solitary confinement. My tendency is to celebrate the nonsensical, which I associate with fugitivity, with the refusal of narrow representations of representation, and with the complex interplay between nothingness and thingliness, the para-ontological field within which the distinction between nothing and some things is constantly improvised. Moreover, I am inclined to understand blackness as situated in the sensuality of the nonsensical, rather than in the a priori, already given, ultimately supersensuality of the epidermal. However much the critique of authenticity is intended to assert a right of difference, the critique of authenticity is often nothing more than a disavowal of ex-sensual, consensual nonsense, which is not just one difference among others, but is precisely the field within which the general right to difference is both theorized and enacted. The difference and relation between color and sense is often treated as a sociological matter. That's how we study, for instance, the way that epidermal differences within the black community, which are manifest not only in the color, but in the volume of one's skin, have been so often aligned with having or not having sense. The analytic of the epidermal elides what it also illuminates, but the main thing is that we have to understand the difference and relation between sharing the social costs that attend epidermalization and distributing the benefits that accrue to sense's irreducible supplementarity. My optimism, or more precisely the operation within which I am held and to and by which I am given, which I would associate with illicit seeing, with multiple sensing, with black theory, which is to say theory, with black history, which is to say history, is in the nonsensical. You could say, if you wanted to, that it manifests itself sometimes as a kind of happiness, being happy to have a steady supply of boots to clean, or whatever. And I would say that this capacity to be happy is the condition of possibility of a necessary critical unhappiness. What I have, insofar as I give it away, lets me know what and under what conditions I should have. What I have is nothing, nonsense. These things, this open set of social things, lets me see that. My grandfather used to shine shoes. And he taught me how to do it too. And I love David Walker. How could I not? You see what I'm trying to say? But I don't think I want to be a man of sense. It aligns you with too much nasty stuff. Hesitant Sociology, Blackness in Poetry, is the name of is the name of a book in progress, which I'm trying to bring to a kind of interminable pause. A long attempt to understand and describe the aesthetics of what political theorist Cedric Robinson calls the Black radical tradition. I've been trying to engage in the work of a critical poetics that tends towards something that might be called critical poetry. Its method is intense attention to social arrangement, including its own. It's an act of empirical imagination, given in a practice of quasi-obsessive revision. And if it culminates an already given critical project, it does so by abolishing that project. I mean to say that it's the end of anything that could be read or understood as an individual project, though how anyone, especially me, could ever have mistaken it for an individual project in the first place is a mystery. I've been concerned for a long time with Black performances as the resistance events of persons denied the capacity to claim normative personhood. How might we account for the convergence of personhood and objecthood, or even thingliness, and what new possibilities for political life are held in the move to claim, rather than disavow or overcome those convergences? I tried to understand Black performances, especially, but not exclusively, musical performances, as embodying this resistance of the object, or this insistence of the thing, making possible a nuanced understanding of Black politics and a more complete sense of the nature of performance in general. Eventually, my concern with forging other notions of objecthood and thingliness that displace the centrality of normative political subjectivity began to move toward an attempt to understand Blackness more emphatically and analytically detached both from Black persons and Black performances as a social force constantly, if often surreptitiously, disruptive of a political ontology predicated in the relay between possessive individual selves and the world they are supposed to inhabit. By way of poet and philosopher Edouard Glissant's suggestive phrase, I've been trying to consider Blackness as consent not to be a single being, a formation that moves not only against the grain of the traditional exclusion of Black people from the world of political subjects, but also against the grain of an understanding of Black aspiration for such membership as constitutive of Black art, Black thought, and Black social life. Often this conflict between the mechanisms of Black exclusion and the aspiration for Black inclusion has been understood in visual terms. So I've been also trying to consider how the dialectic of visibility and invisibility in Afro-diasporic art and thought bears a different valence when the beholder is understood to be Black. I've often thought that a certain tension that persists in the discourse on Blackness and Black people, and which for the last 20 years or so has revolved around the vexed term authenticity, emerges when decorum and delicacy are seen to have been flouted in the seemingly simple act of looking at, which is also to say listening to, Black folks. For how could such acts ever not also be understood as extensions of an emphatically political brutality given in the exclusionary ascription of an identity incompatible with normative personhood, subjectivity, and political citizenship? I mean, part of what I'm trying to say here is like, all this brouhaha over that painting at the Whitney, it's already held and embedded in any act of looking in which a Black person is being looked at, which is part of the reason why one of the phrases that I constantly remember growing up in my neighborhood was, "Who you looking at?" It was there's such a subtle ethics of looking at Black folks that can so constantly and easily be violated, right? That it kind of lets you know that there's something vexed and potentially violent in every moment of such looking, and it doesn't even matter who's doing the looking, okay? And you could be dressed in your Sunday best, looking absolutely fresh, or you know, and I don't mean to be cavalier about it, your body could have just been fished out of the Tallahatchie River after a week of being submerged, right? See, the trouble with interrupting myself is now I can't find where the hell I was. If looking at a Black person already implies a pre-optical and panoptical act of seeing, as critic Irene Tucker recently suggests? How can it be understood as anything other than an act of violence, even, and perhaps especially when another black person does it? In this regard, as an implication of the very idea of regard, how could black sociality, conceived as a drama of failed relationality or thwarted intersubjectivity, ever be anything other than black-on-black violence? On the other hand, what if we consider what it is to look at and listen to blackness, particularly when such attention is detached from a set of assumptions regarding what it is to occupy a point of view? Then we have entered the field of sociology's and poetry's radical entanglement in black study and the mode of ordinary intellectuality and fugitive planning that Stefano Harney and I seek to describe and theorize in the Undercommons. Both the conflict between subject and object and the philosophical dream of their eventual détente depend upon what it is to occupy a point of view. It is my contention that blackness is an ongoing, lived improvisation through the opposition of subject and object that operates in the refusal of the fantasy of an occupiable point of view. Hesitant sociology is what hesitant sociology seeks to enact and extend, study of and in this refusal. What if an alternative to the normalized violence of subject-object relations is at hand? What if our capacity to imagine that alternative in its presence has been so long constrained that it survives only as a general atrophy? What if the modern codification and elaboration of the theory of the subject in the world depends upon and therefore encourages and seeks to naturalize that atrophy? If we consider what Immanuel Kant's critique of the power of judgment, if we consider that Kant's critique of judgment is that theory's keystone, then perhaps his signal contribution to the regulation of imagination is most emphatically located in that text's 50th section, when he declares that the imagination in its lawless freedom produces nothing but nonsense, and must therefore have its wings severely clipped by the understanding. For Kant, poetry is therefore a business of the understanding, and is as such within the understanding's regulatory jurisdiction. This problem of regulation is as political as it is aesthetic, particularly if poetry is considered as a mode of social arrangement that must be brought under normative political controls. The self-organizational in poetry is as problematic for Kant as the self-organizational in politics. These autonomies can even be said to mirror one another in their defiance and disruption of sovereignty. This is to say that the danger autonomy bears is that self-organization is, finally, a disorganization of self in and as the improvisational making of entangled, fleshly, social life. This is what Kant fears and dismisses under the rubric of the swarm in its unchecked generativity. This is what is then valorized, according to Winfried Menninghaus, in and as the romantic poetics of nonsense. The nonsensical and a certain doubly misunderstood conception of the extrasensory, which would imply both that which is unavailable to the senses, but also that which is unavailable to normative thought in its hypersensuality, become available when we consider the poetics of the swarm. Its irregularities, its constant internal differentiations, its defiance of both natural description and metaphysical assumption. Moreover, when we consider that the dismissal of the swarm in Kant, or the gathering of differences in improvisational violence to category and its imperatives, is subject to a reactive and repressive regulation whose first maneuver is the imposition of identitarian disassembly, is inseparable from its racialization, we come to understand the complex entanglement of poetry and blackness, which is racialization's summit and at the same time its excess. It's not an accident that a certain agency of law enforcement within the tendency of conceptual poetry, and which much more often than not accepts whatever benefits accrue to being taken as representative of that tendency, now seeks to extend and deepen Kantian policing of the imagination by way of a regulative incorporation, a reductive conceptual abstraction of blackness in the fetishistic pathologization, literally the autopsy of the so-called black body. Goldsmith. It is important, therefore, to see this present movement not as an anomaly, but rather as a natural development emerging from the regulatory conception of poetry. Similarly, when conceptual poetry thinks itself explicitly as political poetry, this is neither accident nor misprision, but rather an effect of its concern to regulate the irreducible and unaccountable sociality of the swarm, whose constant differentiation is almost always misunderstood as differentiation's absence. I mean, one way to put it is that when you get somebody who thinks that it is a kind of advanced, experimental sentiment to want to suspend or get rid of creativity, that isn't like a reaction to Kantian aesthetics. That's actually a fulfillment of Kantian aesthetics at its most extreme. Which is to say that Goldsmith is a conservative. He's like a neocon with a funny suit. When differentiation is mistaken for individuation, and when individuation is understood to have been properly embodied in the figure of the poet, whose task is then always nothing other than the continual memorialization of his assumed individuation, poetry's problem with blackness comes more sharply into relief, since blackness is traditionally understood to be a natural incapacity for individuation that is in turn guaranteed by juridical, philosophical, and scientific protocols and institutions of enforcement. Marjorie Perlow. If blackness and the regulatory conception of poetry are at odds, it is because the entanglement of blackness and poetry in mutual irregularity, constant differentiation, radical generativity, and generative arrangement is irreducible. Insofar as poetry is how things get together, insofar as poetics takes up the question of how things get together, insofar as in taking up that question, poetry hesitates before the terms things and together, and every assumption they bear, not only about the object in question, but also about whether or not there even is an object in question, then the entanglement of blackness in poetry is itself already entangled with that simultaneously pre- and post-positivist moment in 1905, when in an essay entitled Sociology Hesitant, Auguste Comte is described by W.E.B. Du Bois as being, quote, strangely hesitant as to the real elements of society which must be studied. Were they men or cells or atoms or something subtler than any of these? Hesitant sociology is the conscious and reflective activity of that subtlety, of a plane of myriad subtleties, to echo Paul Laurence Dunbar's unforgettable phrase, while turning it towards a whole other decentralized economy of sense, a general expressivity in excess of the expression of any self. It is both analysis and enactment of rhythm, its constantly alternative fascinations of a syncopation given in immersive, non-perspectival regard, marked in its apposition not only to Comte's hesitation before the surreal, but also his headlong rush for or into an empiricism of the symbolic. Hesitant sociology is studious inhabitation of lawlessly dispersive and dispersive imagination, where presence is given not so much in the absence of meaning, but in the non-reduction of non-meaning when it has been taken for absence. When poetry is considered not only as the written cultivation of what Amiri Baraka called music speech, but also as the generalized making of a living, the ongoing attempt to socialize rather than monopolize the capacity to live beyond our means, then it is impossible to situate another poetics within something that is at least akin to traditional intellectual discourse. That poetics assumes the seriousness and richness of aesthetic endeavor that emerges both before and after the subject and his objects. Such poetics is as evident in cinema, music, and visual art as it is in verse, is as evident in the formation of a barbecue or a house party as in any of the aforementioned artistic genres, even if conventional aesthetic, and for that matter, social scientific or even natural scientific discourse is constrained by its inability so to assume. What usually follows from such constraint are critical dismissals of the merely sociological in Black art, or empiricist relegation of the aesthetic to a zone of apolitical illegitimacy, or disavowals of the alternative that just as often take the form of critiques as they do take the form of defenses of authenticity. But what if the aesthetics of the Black radical tradition aspire to a mode of sociology that is in turn only achievable by way of and as the expression of an active experimental poetics? If those aesthetics move in the service of the preservation through differentiation of what Robinson calls the ontological totality, then we ought to study preservation by joining its interminable hesitation before the terms and concepts that assume and then seek to grasp and regulate an object. What is the ontological totality? What is Blackness? These questions have required a full but surreptitious and fleeting inhabitation of the realm of ontology, one already announced by Du Bois. Hesitant sociology is animated by what it studies and studies what it practices, namely that Blackness disrupts traditional understandings of meaning and being. Just as Blackness's para-ontological nature can be said to confound philosophy, so does its extra-semantic nature confound regulatory poetry, if confound signifies not only disturbance, but also, and precisely by way of disturbance, mutually productive and improvisatory generation. If consent not to be a single being is an attempt to think with and through Blackness's frustration and fruition of philosophy, then hesitant sociology is an attempt to think the imbrication of Blackness and poetry in the ongoing moment and irreducible materiality of their conception as social life in the making. In seeking after the alternative that is at hand, I will do much more than simply suggest that it exists in the segregated zones and dispersed and integrated traces of Black labor. This is to say that it is found in the practices of those upon whom the privileges and underprivileges of Blackness have been and continue insistently to be imposed and ascribed within an oppressive braid of recognition and misrecognition of them as natural and exclusive endowment and deficit. To look at Blackness in and with Black workers in and against the world, but also to listen for Blackness everywhere on earth in its radical and generative dispersal is the task that emerges where sociology and poetry converge. As I suggest above, trying to find it has never been fully separable from trying to avoid it. This antagonism could be characterized as class struggle in Black studies, but it's better understood, I believe, as a dehiscence at the heart of Black study, one that is always potentially generative and degenerative as it sounds a necessary hesitancy, an indispensable and irreducible rhythmic arrhythmia that forgets the belated division between poetry and sociology, sociology and sociality. Okay, so that's part 2. So I got one more part, but I don't know. And yeah, let's have like a cough break. Because it's like bad weather and everybody's sick. So just cough, just cough. And I'm gonna... Yeah, this is like a new tradition I just started of like intermission in the essay. Yeah. Don't feel bad if you gotta go. All right. I got 8 pages to go. Should we just slog ahead? I can just summarize everything. In the wake of post-structuralism and postmodernism, which should be understood not only as a political economy of dispersal, but also as the poetics of experiment, that corresponds with and resists that dispersal. In the various ways that both of these allow for critical investigation of the very idea of subjectivity. And given how the category of the human has been put under the severest pressure by the terrors of colonialism and imperialism, particularly when these are the forces the first world and its others turn upon themselves. Black thought, which is to say black social life, remains a fruitful site for inhabiting and soliciting the human differential within the general ecology. Black thought is the socio-poetic project that examines and enacts these possibilities insofar as they exist over the edge of the separatist, monocultural, monotheistic imperium that will have been defined in and by ontological and epistemological settlement. So that while we must work in admiration of scholars whose attempts to discover and delineate new ontologies and epistemologies bring into sharper relief the limits and limitations of ontologies and epistemologies' joint power and sphere of influence, it is from those terminable interminabilities of passage, which NourbeSe Philip announces in anthemic song, that we won't and can't return. In turn, in this continually eccentric turning in the plane of no return, in the constant dislocation of our endless arrival, we book passage on this transportive thought, that modernity, the confluence of the slave trade, settler colonialism, and the democratization of sovereignty, in the ongoing making and unmaking of patriarchal racial capitalism through which the world is imaged, graphed, and grasped, is a socio-ecological disaster that can neither be calculated nor conceptualized as a series of personal injuries. Consider Philip, whose example is so prodigious and so profound. Consider in particular her song, first published in 2008, but in progress now, insofar as it continues to deepen and unfold in rich eruptions of aniteration and non-performance. The story whose telling Zong seizes, the seizure whose toll Zong sings is well known. In 1781, the captain of the slave ship Zong, a vessel of Dutch manufacture, which earlier had been called Zorg, or Care, ordered that some 150 Africans be thrown overboard so that the ship's owners could collect insurance taken out on their lost cargo. Philip's eruptive interruption of the long unnatural history that envelops and exceeds that event takes up the unseemly phonic proximity of song and zong. Philip's heroism, which emerges as a radical disavowal of the heroic, consists in a deep and fatal sounding. Strangely, she descends into a place from which neither return nor recovery are possible. Because it is of the eternal stranger, that place's character is that of a non-place, a zone of differentiated stress and distress, whose particular gathering of trouble is not alleviated but redoubled by a transfer of energy from atopos to utopia that even all brutality and remembrance cannot still. The one who dives, who falls into the wreck of the ship, cannot come back for or as or by herself, but there is a frayed, refrained remainder that is more than both the reality and the dream of subjectivity. What remains is more than incalculable loss. The logic of this supplement, whose appearance as fade and induced forgetting is terribly beautiful, dictates that the next word be nevertheless. Nevertheless, this deprivation is sung forevermore. Flung into and out of the depths, there's a broken psalm of gathered brokenness whose exhausted articulation by degrees, through every remote displacement of confinement and expanse, is given to us now as preservation, lifting into fugal centrifugal air, the lyrical imposition of the commercium, the celebration of our funereal, venereal mass. En masse, Philip realizes this inescapable and overwhelming truth that insofar as the story of the Zong cannot be told or sung alone, it isn't a story, it isn't anybody's story at all. Zong is the story of nobody. and it can't be sung alone. The soloist, the chorister whose C preceded the choir, has come to tell you that and nothing more. What remains is that she who is no more, who cannot come, has come to tell you that there's nothing more than that incalculable loss and supplement. She has come to tell you what she cannot tell, to tell you that she cannot come. Sent with a song for you to sound, a scar to swoon, a swarm to send you to. There's just this sending, nothing more. Whatever an extraordinary rendition precedes must be in haptic concert, the irreducible sociality of Black descent and dissent, Black assent and assent, in profoundly exhausted, animated, and animative consent of lyric communicability. One of the things that Philip was sent to remind us is that poetry doesn't care too much about the difference between verse and prose. A vehicular grunt or boom, the musical indirection of the language lab, our mantic appositionality in dissent as dissent. That's the shit as far as poetry is concerned. Concerned as poetry is with fighting sentential and sententious hegemonies that correspond to the reactionary regulative violence of the settler, the displaced encloser trying to set up the United States of the abstract individual. The city on the hill, that mighty fortress, is what Philip, the soloist who is not one, stands against in concert in her amplified projection from the microphone to the speakerphone, cutting the auditorium, which is permeated with the submarine choir that sent her. She saturates the sanctuary with her forces. She makes a sign that says she can't stop singing. Certainly, Philip is a danger to herself and others. This is to say that her poetry blurs, its terrible play confirmed after and against the grain of the very idea of the work. Kant says we're supposed to derive from the work, in its completeness, some sense of its rule. But what about the openness of the work, its internal sociality, as well as the social relations of its own production, which not only escape, but also succeed the work seizure, not to mention that rubbing of the work, that rubs the very idea of the work out and into the everyday crowding of our everyday whole, and therefore allows and requires the anti-interpretive erotics that Susan Sontag called for in Against Interpretation, but which her commitment to the work, to its accompanying metaphysics of discretion, kept her from imagining. This set of ethical questions turns out to be ecological as well. What sustains us in, what sustains itself as poetry, what poetry calls upon us to sustain in and of itself, is impure production's antiproductive, degenerative, and regenerative madness. And it's still going crazy. The prophetic and projective announcement of the work's opening, which was also a description of a general socio-ecological poiesis, an imaginative compact with love as well as lunacy, brought more fully into relief in and by socio-ecological disaster. This openness, this dissonance, this residual informality, this refusal to coalesce, this differential resistance to enclosure, this sounded animateriality, this breaking vessel and broken flesh is poetry, one of whose other names, but not just one name among others, is blackness. To think poetry in the name of its blackness is crucially to consider the work's generative incompletion, along with that of the one who is supposed to have made it. The work presupposes a productive self, an onto-monotheological presumption with which many contemporary poets have tried to dispense. The trouble being that we have to account for the provenance and the fate of the ones who dispense it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, Kant and Adorno are always here to help us with this. So this is from the Critique of Judgment, and then two passages from Kant. He writes, "Genius is the talent or natural gift that gives the rule to art. Since the talent, as an inborn productive faculty of the artist, itself belongs to nature, this could also be expressed thus. Genius is the inborn predisposition of the mind through which nature gives the rule to art." Then later he writes in Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View, the proper field for genius is that of the power of imagination, because this is creative, and being less under the constraint of rules and other faculties, it is thus all the more capable of originality. It is true that the mechanism of instruction is indeed disadvantageous to the building of a genius to the budding of a genius as far as his originality is concerned, because instruction always requires the student to imitate. But every art still requires certain mechanical basic rules, namely rules concerning the inappropriateness of the product to the underlying idea. Rules concerning the appropriateness of the product to the underlying idea. That is, truth in the presentation of the object that one is thinking of. Now this must be learned by means of school rigor, and is indeed always an effective imitation. However, to free the power of imagination even from this constraint and allow the talent proper to it to proceed without rules and swoon, and the German word for swoon is Schwärmen, and Schwärmen is connected to swarm, which I'll get back to later. Okay, but even against nature might deliver original folly, but it would certainly not be exemplary and thus would not be counted as genius. Even in Charles Olson, whom I've been shamelessly and religiously chanting in my head this whole time, there's a massive problematic regarding the relations between genius, generative power, rule, concept, invention, purposiveness, and nature. The unnatural, the unprecedented is there, awaiting discovery. You could ask, is genius that which gives or that which breaks the rule? And then you could say that giving and breaking are all devotionally bound up with one another. Let's call this monkish criminality Monk's Law, in honor of Thelonious' constantly aesthetically felonious flouting of rule, which requires and allows us to inquire as to the nature of the rule that nature gives to art. If the proper, i.e. open and unoriginally improper field for genius is imagination, because imagination flouts rule, then how do we speak of the rule that emerges from rule's eclipse? Eclipse, but not absence, evidently, for every art requires, according to Kant, certain basic mechanical rules, namely rules concerning the appropriateness of the product to the underlying idea. This conception of rules is tied to a certain understanding of art as the representation of an idea that in turn underlies or undergirds the product or work. Kant speaks of this in relation to truth, truth in the presentation of the object that one is thinking of. But what if representation is the instantiation of a radical impropriety? What if truth is given in and by way of this dehiscence? This is something Adorno approaches by way of the notion of what he calls the Bewegungsgesetz, which is usually translated as the law of motion, and by way of its relation to radical art's primary and necessary darkness. These are three passages from Adorno's aesthetic theory. 1. The inner consistency through which artworks participate in truth always involves their untruth. In its most unguarded manifestations, art has always revolted against this. And today this revolt has become art's own law of movement. 2. Artwork's paradoxical nature, stasis, negates itself. The movement of artworks must be at a standstill and thereby become visible. Their imminent processual character, the legal process that they undertake against the merely existing world that is external to them, is objective prior to their alliance with any party. To survive reality, this is 3. To survive reality at its most extreme and grim, artworks that do not want to sell themselves as constellation must equate themselves with that reality. Radical art today, and he's writing this in the mid-60s, is synonymous with dark art. Its primary color is black. Much contemporary art is irrelevant because it takes no note of this and childishly delights in color. He's a cold man. What if genius is a kind of extra-legal lawfulness, or a legality given in the breaking and making of rules? This, again,
would be Monk taking the law out in some ana-Benedictine frenzy, some ana-processual practice, some holy, ana-original, ana-performative folly. Does the rule, the concept, the category come first? Does a rule, an idea of form, come first even before the informal, out of which form might be said to have been generated? How does an improvisation begin? From here, you could ask two more questions. How does the entrance into compositional song form begin? What are the social conditions for the form's emergence? But you could also ask, how do we enter into an improvisation, and how does the improvisation become recognizable, or does it ever become recognizable as a work of art? What if we refuse the distinction between fine art and handiwork? Monk's dissident elbow work, the imposition of position in his halting dance, its extended recursion and still moving. What if the practice of art is improvisation's continual breaking and making of the rule of art, in jurisgenerative refusal, in official recusal, in the continual putting into play of the very idea of the work of art? Then Monk's law, Monk's supersubjunctive mood becomes Monk's dream, Monk's dramatic, anorchestral, anatraumatic fantasy, moving as if swarm and swoon were meant to be together in a Louis Zukowski translation, in deliverance of old new foolishness, exemplary and supernatural. But what if I'm moving independently of the notion of the priority of the concept or rule, which is to say, before the distinction between invention and discovery, which is the ground for Kant upon which genius rests? What is it that we have in mind? What fleshly, fugitive, dispossessive animation of mind is given when we begin to improvise? Do we have in mind a representation, a concept, a rule, a model that instantiates the very possibility of what we will have done? Or is there a common social underground capacity for such representation, which will have always turned out to have been retrospectively projected onto our activity with no beginning and no end, calling into question, precisely as it calls into being, the very terms of the distinction between the new thing and what was already there, that troubles mind and whatever it is that mind is supposed to have? The representational theory of mind is supposed to deal with the problem of unchecked genius, unchecked generativity, unchecked sensual materiality. Again, the imagination in its lawless freedom needs to have its wings severely clipped by the understanding, a formulation that sets in motion intellectual law enforcement's paradoxically jurispathic hurdle towards positivism. But what if the understanding is itself a function of the imagination and must itself be checked? What if men of sense need to be checked by men who don't have any? Poetry is the highest verbal art, the place where this interplay of creativity and rule manifests itself in such a way as to prove more or less constantly the capacity for the supersensual to assert itself, after all, in triumph over the tumultuous derangements of original folly, of this constant tendency for unruly materialization and differing. Again, what's at stake is a certain way of understanding how nature gives rule and how poetry gives that giving with austere extravagance. But when Olson speaks of the sentence as the first act of nature, he does so within a general permission poetry takes to push on and against that, to pass through the sentence in its passing, its having been passed, to submit the sentence to a terrible modality of passage, a horribly excluded middle passion, Phillips's extra musical plea, her complex plea, her deeply wrought and incalculable ply, which constantly makes new poetic law, which insistently and mournfully celebrates poetry's jurisgenerative capacity in its enactment of it, in the refusal of rule. In her commitment to division and recollection, in her eternal, internal, discomposed, ana-computational commutation of the natural sentence, in her deep social hesitation in passage, in her sounding of that depth and in her depth deepening of its sound, Philip is sent with profound propulsion to show us how the solo goes awry when poetry, physics, topology, and sociology in Blackness enact their recessive, excessive rendezvous. Now, there was a whole section of this that I cut out, and I only have one paragraph to go. And I was talking about rumination and regurgitation, which are the same thing. Like one rumination, deep thought, to chew something over, right? Well, rumination syndrome is this tendency to vomit or to regurgitate in humans. Regurgitation in the animal world is often voluntary, right? It's a way of nurturing or, of feeding offspring. And I was totally interested in this interplay between rumination and regurgitation because rumination is also a kind of tendency to dwell on the same problem over and over again without solving that problem, which is a particular symptom of what people call manic depression, right? And I was thinking, well, poetry is a kind of manic depression. It's like that thing where you just think about the same thing over and over again. I've been thinking about the same 3 things for 27 years. But regurgitation, as another modality of rumination, came into play this past quarter when I was teaching Phyllis Wheatley. And one of my students was remarking upon sort of well-known Phyllis Wheatley poem which is called On Being Brought from Africa to America, in which she thanks God for her deliverance. And my students were like, why is she just regurgitating this crazy white people stuff? I kept thinking, well, is she providing a kind of nourishment for us? Is she constrained to regurgitate that formulation in ways that tells us something and gives us a clue, right, about the nature of the struggle for Black liberation? Because if liberation is predicated on the achievement of the capacities of the man of sense, if liberation is the activity of the man of sense, if liberation, in fact, requires us to enact a certain set of normative capacities of personality, right? In other words, if liberation requires us to be able to have sense enough to know how degraded we are, to be smart enough to know how unhappy we should be, right? In such a way, and if the way in which we recognize the lack of our capacity for rumination, which is in itself a modality of degradation, is when we see some happy Black person who must in fact always be working class, who has to be shining somebody's shoes, right? If we see them in what we conceive of as their radical incapacity to know, right, that they should be unhappy, how much of that also constitutes a regurgitation of precisely the modes of normativity which we dog Phyllis Wheatley for? Why do we dog Phyllis Wheatley for those formulations? Celebrate David Walker for his. Right? We should celebrate them both, is my opinion. Okay? But part of what's at stake in the celebration of them is critiquing precisely the intensity with which they both regurgitate and ruminate over these modes of normativity. And what we might want to do is pay more close attention to the man who sings how happy he is to shine some shoes, right? Not because we would then transcend every particular understanding of degradation that we would associate with the shining of shoes, as well as with Black happiness. Because what if it's in fact the Black capacity to be happy that constitutes our revolutionary capacity, right? Rather than the manic depressive intensity of our rumination on our own degradation. So that was the part that I skipped, and I said that so that this last paragraph would make sense. In ruminating on the ruminative condition, the soloist, as Robert Frost once said of Shakespeare, brings pain and suffering to a higher plane of regard. But by the end of Sociology Hesitant, Du Bois's essay, it is not only the division between poetry and sociology, but also that between these elements and the natural sciences that is forgotten. It is as if for Du Bois, the study of Black social life requires the renewal of a project novalis called the science of science. The empirical will have, in this sense, been given not just in some profound radicalization or authentication of empiricism, but in an intellectual activity of common sensuality and sensitivity, wherein the senses become, as Marx once prophesied, theoreticians in their practice. What's at stake here is not the higher plane of regard individuated consciousness makes available, but the low-down undercommon reactivation of the sensorium, wherein looking will have only been given in synesthetic sociality. At stake is movement within what might be called black topological existence, from what is supposed to be the ground of a capacity to have an experience and bear a concept, to such capacities recess in which experience is dispersed in and as the sharing of sculptural, environmental, paraliterary, post-cinematically performative attention, right? That what one wants and desires from Wheatley on the one hand in a way which is unfair because she was so radically withheld from black sociality, but what one wants more from Walker because he did have these capacities, right? Is to say, let me not look at this abject, degraded being. Let me look with him, right? The movement I am describing is one from manic depression to mantic disposition. It is emphatic feel, sympathetic philosophy, synthetic enthusiasm, divinatory communism, where blackness and poetry are more plus less than one.